Chapter 10 of Ester Ried Yet Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried Yet Speaking by Pansy. Chapter 10. And She Always Tried. Other business was transacted that morning which brought results. A curious habit of Mrs. Roberts, one of which perhaps most strongly marked the difference between her ways of working and those of other people, was that of appealing to the person at hand for information on any subject which chanced to be the one prominent in her mind at the time. Where other and more systematic persons would have said, "He is not the one to ask about this matter, there is no reason for supposing that he has any knowledge in this direction," Mrs. Roberts would say, "I cannot be sure that he may not be able to give just the information which I need. In any case, what harm will it do to try?" And she always tried. It was on this principle that she arrested Dr. Everett's speedy departure with a question. "Dr. Everett, are you familiar with boarding houses for young men?" Something like a vision swept instantly before the doctor, in which he saw the long line of young men, and the long line of boarding houses, in the world, and he laughed with eyes and lips, the question seemed so queerly put. "With how many of them, madame?" There was amusement in his voice, but there was also curiosity. He wanted to know what this original little lady was in search of. "One would do, if it were just the right stamp. I'll tell you what I want. A nice, quiet, comfortable, home sort of place, with a small room, capable of being warmed, a single bedstead with a passably good bed, and a moderate rate of board. Are not those modest enough requirements?" "Not at all. They are preposterous. A boarding house to which one could conveniently apply the word home! Fire in a young man's room! He is expected to enjoy freezing in a city, and if he came from the country, he should be grateful for the privilege. But the idea of calling for a good bed! That is the wildest suggestion of all. Has she ever boarded, Mr. Roberts?" "Not at a boarding house, at least," said that gentleman, enjoying the fun. But Mrs. Roberts looked grave. "Are you serious?" she asked gently. "Is there no chance in this great city for a Christian young man to have the ordinary comforts of common life, just a little quiet room where he can pray, and where he can invite some tempted soul and try to help him? Doesn't it seem all wrong?" The laugh was gone from the doctor's face. There was a look of keen interest and genuine respect. "How many young men were you thinking about? There are many Christians, I believe, among that class, poor young men away from home, and I have reason to fear that their chances for comfortable retirement are very scarce. I have thought about the problem somewhat, how to help them. In the concrete, I don't see the way. Of how many are you thinking?" "I am willing to think about them all," Mrs. Roberts said, and now it was her turn to laugh. "But I am panning for just one. I cannot work in great ways, but I thought I might help one." "Exactly. Mr. Roberts, if every Christian in our city would undertake to help one, the problem would be solved. Well, there is one boarding house to which the word home may properly be applied, and there is one small room on the 3rd floor vacated yesterday. I wonder if the master wants it for your young man? It seems to me, if there is any one thing more than another that we need in that house just now, it is a Christian young man. Of what type is your friend? Will he help or hinder a gay young scamp much sought after by Satan?" "He will try hard to help," said both Mr. and Mrs. Roberts, and before they parted the doctor had taken Mr. Ried's address, and promised to call on him and negotiate the matter. "That plan will work in 2 ways," said Mrs. Roberts gleefully. "Mr. Ried will be in the same home with, and somewhat under the influence of that grand doctor. Isn't it splendid that we asked just him?" And her husband smilingly assented, and added that he should not have thought of such a thing as asking him. On her way downtown, Mrs. Roberts had dropped a letter in the mail, which also brought results. It read thus: "Dear Marion, I have time for but a line, for I want to catch the morning mail. I have such a nice plan. Suppose you let your Gracie come and stay with me for a few weeks. You know she always liked me a little, and Evan and I think we can make it pleasant for her. I will try to get her so much interested in 7 boys whom I know, that she will forget all about Professor Ellis. Mr. Barnwell, a confidential clerk in the store, old and gray-headed, will go tomorrow to transact some business with papa. Evan will give him a letter of introduction to Dr. Dennis. He expects to return on Saturday, and if you will trust Gracie to us, and she is willing to come, she might travel in Mr. Barnwell's care, and we would meet her at the depot. Dear Marion, we should like it ever so much, and I have prayed about it all the morning, and cannot help thinking that Jesus likes it too." Thus it came to pass that when Mrs. Roberts took her seat on the next Sabbath afternoon before her 7 boys at the South End Mission, a vision of loveliness, such as the mission had not often seen, came in with her, and looked with wide open eyes on all the new and strange sights and sounds about her. A very pretty creature was Gracie Dennis. Her eyes had lost none of their brightness, although they had shed some tears during her recent experiences. They were fairly sparkling today, for the great city into which she had come for the first time was like fairyland to her, albeit she had passed through scenes that afternoon which bore no resemblance to her idea of fairyland. What the boys thought of her could only be determined from their stares. Let us hope that her presence had nothing to do with their conduct, for never, in all the annals of the South End Mission, had 7 boys comported themselves as did those before whom Mrs. Roberts sat that winter afternoon. Nimble Dick, as if to be revenged for his unintentional courtesy of the Monday before, placed his ill-kept feet on the seat in front of him in alarming proximity to Mrs. Roberts' shoulders, and chewed his tobacco, and defiled the floor with its juice, and talked aloud, and was in every sense disgusting. Neither was Dirk Colson one whit behind him. The spirit of entertainment was upon him. He mimicked Mr. Durant's somewhat hoarse tones, exaggerating the imitation, of course, until it was ludicrous. He imitated the somewhat shrill tenor and the nasal tones of Deacon Carter, who was doing good work with a class of meek-looking women. He even imitated Mrs. Roberts' soft, low voice, as she essayed to interest them in Moses and some of the wonders which he performed. Vain hope! Struggle as she might to be intensely dramatic in her narrative, she did not for a moment gain the ascendancy. "Moses?" interrupted Nimble Dick in the very midst of one of her most earnest sentences. "Let's see, he was the old fellow who swallowed the serpents, wasn't it? I should have thought he would have been used up." "You don't know nothin'," interrupted Stephen Crowley, with a nudge at Dirk that the latter pretended tipped him entirely off the seat, and left him a limp heap at Mrs. Roberts' feet. "He don't know nothin'," repeated Stephen, addressing Mrs. Roberts in a confidential tone. "'Twas the serpents swallowed Moses, wasn't it? Question is, how did he get around again?" "Quit that!" came at this point from Dirk Colson in his fiercest tone. "Look here, you Bill Snyder, if you try pinching on me again, I'll pitch you over the head of old Durant in less than a second." What was the poor, pale little woman to do? With one boy crawling about the floor, and 2 others in a hand-to-hand fight, with the rest in a giggle, of what use to try to talk to them about Moses? You should have seen Gracie Dennis's eyes by that time. Horror and disgust were about equally expressed, and rising above them both, a look of actual fear. Mr. Durant came over to attempt a rescue, his face distressed beyond measure. "Mrs. Roberts, this is too much. I am sure that patience has ceased to be a virtue. They have never gone so far before. I suspected mischief today. I have heard from several of them during the week, and never anything but evil. I am prepared for it. There is a full police force on guard in the next room. What I propose is to have every one of these fellows taken to the lock-up. It will be a lesson that they richly deserve, and may do them good." Whispering was not one of Mr. Durant's strong points. He meant to convey secret intelligence of carefully laid plans to Mrs. Roberts alone. In reality, not a boy in the class but heard every word. They were startled into silence. A full police force! They were not fonder of the lock-up than are most boys who deserve that punishment. They were skillful in escaping the hands of policemen. They had not believed that the South End Mission would resort to any such means. They recognized in the mission an attempt to do them good, and, without any effort at reasoning it out, they had by tacit consent decided that policemen and lock-ups and Christian effort did not match. They had chuckled much over the stationing of "Little Duffer" at the door on guard. Any 2 of the strong young fellows were a match for him, and in the event of a riot, which they would like no better fun than to help get up, how many choice spirits all about the room would join them if given the word, and in the delightful confusion which would result, how easy to escape from sight and hearing while Policeman Duffer was summoning aid. They had felt comparatively safe. But a full police force detailed for duty was quite another thing. They felt caught in a trap. Nimble Dick got up in haste from the floor and took his seat, and the boys looked from one to another with ominous frowns. There were reasons why none of them cared to come before the police court just now. What was to be done? While they waited and considered, Mrs. Roberts did it. Her hand was on Mr. Durant's arm, and directly the loud whispering ceased, she spoke in slow but distinctly emphatic tones. "I beg of you, Mr. Durant, do no such thing. I would dismiss every policeman at once, with thanks, if I were you. We shall not need their help. I give you my word of honor that the boys will be quiet during the rest of the session, not because they are afraid of policemen, but because they respect me, and do not want to see me frightened or annoyed. Please don't let a policeman come near us." I am not sure which was the more astonished, the superintendent or the boys. He returned to his desk with the bewildered air of one whose deep-laid schemes had come to naught in an unexpected manner, without giving him time to rally, and the boys looked at one another in perplexity, and were silent. Mrs. Roberts turned to them with quiet voice. "Boys," she said, "you have spoiled the story that I was going to tell you. I have lost my place, and there isn't time to go back and find it. I am sorry, for I think you would have liked the story. I spent a good deal of time this week trying to make it interesting. But never mind now, there is something else I want to say. Will you spend the hours from 8 to 10 with me tomorrow evening at my house? I brought cards with me for each of you, containing my address, that you might have no trouble in finding the place." Whereupon she produced the delicate bits of pasteboard, with her name and address handsomely engraved thereon. Nimble Dick took his between his soiled thumb and finger, turned it over in a pretense of great interest, and finally endeavored to sight it with his eye as a workman does his board. "What'll you do with us if we come?" Stephen Crowley asked, fixing what was intended to be a wise look upon her, the leer in his eye hinting that he was smart enough to see another trap, and meant not to fall into it. Mrs. Roberts laughed pleasantly. "It is an unusual question when one invites company," she said, "but I don't mind answering it. For one thing I thought we would have an oyster stew and some good coffee together. Then, if any of you like music, I have a friend with me who is a good singer; and I have a few pictures I should like you to see, if you cared to; and, I don't know whether you are fond of flowers, but some of you may have a mother or sister at home who is, and the greenhouse is all aglow just now. Oh, how can I tell you what I should do to entertain guests? Just what seemed to me to be pleasant at the time. That is the way I generally do. May I expect you?" The boys stared. This was a new departure, indeed. How much of it did she mean? What was she trying to do? Was it a trap? Still, she had rescued them from the police force, and they had not expected that, for every boy of them knew that he had treated her shamefully. Timothy Haskell was generally the quietest one of the group, and perhaps the most straightforward. He went directly to the point of the question that he saw in the eyes of the others. "What do you do it for?" "Yes, that's the talk," said Nimble Dick. "What do you want of us?" "Why, I want you to spend the evening with me. Didn't I tell you? If you really mean to be friends with me, of course I must invite you to my home. What could I want except to have a nice time? I'm trying to make you like me. Of course I want you to like me. How can we have pleasant times together unless you do?" End of chapter 10. Recording by Trisha G.